The first time I heard the name Dunhill was at a regional historic architecture conference held in the quiet town of St. Verena in northeastern Maine. One of the speakers mentioned an old glass greenhouse built by a now extinct aristocratic lineage, the Dunhills, whose mansion, he said, still hid among the damp trees of a property sealed off decades ago. It wasn't exactly my area of focus, but the way he described the place, a garden where the earth never stopped devouring, stuck in my mind. If this story has already made you uncomfortable, maybe you should subscribe to the channel. Trust me, the revelations ahead are far more disturbing. I returned home with that name throbbing in my thoughts. Dunhill. I did some surface level digging and found almost nothing. Just a brief article from 1985 about the demolition of ruins in Black Hollow, an isolated village in the Catskill Mountains of New York State. The article was dry, almost bureaucratic, but something bothered me. The remains were incinerated by court order. Whose remains? As an investigative journalist, I've been to many places that preferred to stay forgotten. But driving down that winding road toward Black Hollow, I had the distinct feeling I was heading into something personal. The village seemed frozen in time, with its antique street lamps, cracked bell tower, and houses boarded up since the 1960s. No one spoke of the Dunhills directly, but the mere mention of the name was enough to close faces, as if the cold in the air wasn't from the weather, but from memory. I discovered that the Dunhills weren't tied to a single location. Before permanently settling in Black Hollow at the end of the 19th century, they passed through other towns along the East Coast. Scattered records point to the family's presence in Salem in 1843, in Providence in 1861, and even in rural southern Pennsylvania, where an abandoned plantation still bears the name Dunhill Grove. In all these places there were traces of lush gardens sprouting from barren land, and in all, stories of unexplained disappearances. But it was in Black Hollow that their rituals reached their apex. The family mansion, a Victorian structure with angular towers and deep basements, stood atop a hill surrounded by ancient oaks. Despite decades of abandonment, the garden remained, flowers of uncertain origin, with black petals and a metallic scent, blooming from soil darker than usual. They say no animal dares cross that ground, and that during the new moon, you can see crawling forms moving through the leaves. The local records were deliberately fragmented, missing tax documents, incomplete land deeds, and an almost surgical absence of family photographs after 1924. At the small historical museum in the region, I found a single visual mention, an oil painting, faceless, signed T. Dunhill, Roman numeral 13. That number would appear again and again in various fragments, diaries, inscriptions in the mansion attic, even etched into a medallion buried in the garden. That Roman numeral 13 didn't seem to be just a number, but a rule, a cycle. Phrases were tied to it, always written in the same sharp handwriting. Roman numeral 13 times we offer. Roman numeral 13 times it blooms. Apparently every 13-year cycle required 13 cremated bodies. The ashes fed the soil, and the soil in return gave something back. Over the following days, I dove into old records, entered abandoned homes, and spoke to people who would rather forget. The name Dunhill was everywhere, in cracked walls, in mirrors draped with sheets, in ashes carried away by the wind, and yet no one dared speak the name aloud. When I received the letter, I thought it was a mistake. It arrived without ceremony. A manila envelope yellowed by time, postmarked from Essex County, New York. Inside, a single-page legal document and a photograph. The document, stamped by the probate court, stated that I was the sole beneficiary of a property known as the Dunhill Estate, located in the outskirts of Black Hollow, a village I had just started researching for unrelated reasons. The photo was old, black and white, showing a withered mansion choked in ivy, with a glass greenhouse to its side and a faint outline of what appeared to be stone archways beyond it. I had never heard of a Dunhill in my family tree, but the name signed at the bottom of the inheritance notice was familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Bequeathed by Thomas Emery Dunhill, Roman numeral 13 of the bloodline. The ink was fresh. The stamp dated barely 3 weeks prior. I drove north the following morning. The journey to Black Hollow felt longer than it should have. I left the interstate after the first 100 miles and took rural routes through thinning forests, past collapsing barns and roadside cemeteries so overgrown, they looked more like overgrown gardens than final resting places. Cell service vanished by mile 84. By mile 91, even the radio had turned to static. It was as if the land itself had chosen to mute the world. The gates were rusted iron, half open, with vines gripping their bars like skeletal hands. The gravel driveway wound through skeletal trees for what felt like a mile before the mansion appeared. Not suddenly, but as if it had always been there, just outside the reach of my vision. The house was dying beautifully, 3 stories tall, with steep gables and windows like hollow eyes. The Dunhill mansion seemed preserved in decay. Shingles were missing, and the porch sagged under its own weight. But the structure stood, proud, unyielding, as though its roots went deeper than stone. The greenhouse behind the house was fractured glass and rusted iron, yet inside, something still bloomed. The smell of soil, rich, pungent, reached me before I even opened the car door. Inside, the air was dense. Dust floated like ash in every room. The furniture was covered in moth-eaten sheets, and behind them, dark wood shone faintly, untouched by time. Oil paintings lined the hallways, every face blurred, slashed, or obscured, except one. A woman with a garden behind her, standing beside a child who held a silver urn. I found the keys in a porcelain bowl by the staircase. Underneath them, a folded letter addressed simply, "To the last." The handwriting was exquisite, like that of a 19th century clerk. I opened it with the tremor of someone already too deep. "If you are reading this, the soil has accepted you. Roman numeral 13 cycles. Roman numeral 13 caretakers. You are the final. Do not resist the bloom. The inheritance is not the house, it is the hunger. T.E. Dunhill." For the next few days, I stayed in town, trying to gather records. But Black Hollow's municipal building was always under renovation. The library was closed due to mold. The Historical Society had burned down in 1977, the year the fire consumed most of the Dunhill property, according to a man I met at the diner. When I asked about the fire, he simply said, "Some roots burn, some don't." Back at the house, I began exploring the basement. The door was padlocked with a brass lock that broke in my hand, almost as if it had been weakened from within. The stairs creaked as I descended into darkness. The basement was dry, almost unnaturally so. Along the walls, shelves were lined with urns, ceramic, metal, stone, each inscribed with a number and a year. Some went back as far as 1891. I counted 13 per shelf, 13 shelves in total. Near the back, a furnace. Cold, but not abandoned. It looked modern, incongruously so, with an instruction sheet clipped beside it. At first, I thought it was for heating. Then I noticed the ash collector beneath. It was labeled Yield Chamber. A metal plaque above it read, "To dust, the bloom." On the ground near the furnace, half buried in dust, was a child's sketchbook. The cover had been torn off. Inside, the drawings began innocently enough. Trees, houses, a sun with a face. But by page 13, the images changed. Urns with hands, flowers with teeth, people sleeping beneath roots, and a recurring figure, a tall man with a mask made of bark, labeled in shaky letters as the gardener. I found the name Thomas Emery Dunhill in a birth record dated 1924. His death was never recorded, but curiously, every 13 years since his birth, there had been a missing persons case in the region, always involving exactly 13 people. Farmers, travelers, even 2 police officers. Their bodies were never found. Only one note ever remained behind. In the case of a woman named Elsie March, vanished in 1976, found scrawled in her diary, "They told me the soil remembers." I didn't want to believe it. I tried sleeping in the mansion that night, but something moved in the greenhouse. I heard the crunch of glass, the creak of vines against the pane, and once, a soft knock on the window, too low to be human. I didn't answer, but I stayed. The next morning, I began digging in the garden. Beneath the flower beds, I found bones. The bones I unearthed were not buried with care. Just beneath the garden's topsoil, amid twisted roots and a carpet of jet-black roses, I uncovered the fragmented remains of at least 3 individuals. The bones were pale, brittle, and scorched, as though they'd been cremated incompletely. One skull still bore a line of copper wire coiled through the eye sockets. At first I thought it was an accident. Then I noticed the same wire was tied around what remained of the femur, a loop, twisted 13 times. That night I opened the attic. The 3rd floor of the mansion had been nailed shut from the inside, planks layered over the doorway like ribs over a heart. I pried them loose with a rusted crowbar I found in the cellar. The door creaked open slowly, revealing an attic dry as parchment and thick with dust. Light filtered in through a single dormer window, casting narrow columns across what appeared to be dozens of crates, trunks, and sealed cabinets. In one of the trunks, I found documents, birth certificates, land deeds, faded photographs, and an enormous leather-bound book. The book smelled like mold and smoke. Its title, pressed into the cover, read, "On the Cultivation of Bloom and Ash." Beneath it, a subtitle, Roman numeral 13, The Sacred Cycle of the Garden. Inside, the writing was both meticulous and deranged. Pages were numbered not in Arabic numerals, but in Roman, each chapter a new cycle. The earliest entry was dated Cycle 1, year 1883, signed by Thomas Gregory Dunhill. It described the acquisition of land in southern Vermont and the planting of the seed gifted to us by the figure in the forest. The following passages were filled with references to rituals, instructions, and the necessity of human reduction into particulate nourishment. Only ash awakens the bloom. Only sacrifice completes the 13. Cycle 2, year 1896. The entries continued. Every 13 years, a new hand would take over the writing. Thomas Augustus Dunhill, Thomas Eliot Dunhill, Thomas Emery Dunhill. The line continued unbroken for more than 1 century. In every cycle, the same sequence unfolded. 13 offerings burned to ash, scattered beneath the garden's heart. In return, the soil would grant continuity, protection, and revelation. There were diagrams of the greenhouse's foundation, arranged not as a typical garden, but as a sigil, geometric and unnerving. The 12th cycle, Roman numeral 12, was different. The writing was frantic, ink spilled and lines crossed. It warned of bloodline erosion and the soil rejecting the seed. There were references to failed blooms, to echoes in the roots, and one sentence written in large, shaking letters across the margin. We skipped one. The 13 must not be broken. Beside the book, inside the same trunk, were photographs. Some were crisp, showing stern men and women in period dress standing in the garden, always in groups of 13. Others had been mutilated, faces scratched out, edges burned, or symbols inked across the backs. One symbol in particular appeared repeatedly, a flower with spiraling roots wrapped around a skull. Beneath it, written in old ink, "The gardener sees." In a cabinet near the window, I discovered more personal artifacts, letters, children's drawings, and 2 diaries. The first belonged to someone named Elsie Dunhill, dated between the years 1929 and 1934. The entries were vivid, almost lyrical, but laced with dread. Father says I mustn't speak to the flowers after sundown. He says they repeat things. I asked what he meant. He didn't answer, just tightened the wires on the urns again. November 3rd, 1931. Another entry. There's a room under the greenhouse, a stone circle with holes in the floor. I saw him down there. He wore the bark mask again. I think Father calls him the Sour. April 17th, 1933. The second diary was incomplete, pages torn, some water damaged. It belonged to a boy named Jacob, no surname, who appeared to have lived on the property in the late 1950s. His handwriting was jagged, uneven, and deeply fearful. They say if we don't feed the dirt, it feeds itself. I heard something moving under the greenhouse last night. It called me by name. Cycle 10, year 1957. Jacob's final entry read only, "The urns are full, but they keep asking for more." Throughout the attic, signs of obsession bloomed like fungus. Walls were marked with chalk symbols. Pieces of root had been nailed into boards, studied like relics. I found dozens of newspaper clippings taped to one wall, articles about missing persons in Essex County, each dated in 13-year increments. The gaps were precise. The names were never repeated. On the floor beneath the window, a large canvas had been placed face down. When I flipped it, I felt my throat tighten. It was a painting, almost photographic, of the greenhouse in full bloom. But there were figures visible in the garden, beneath the soil, faces turned upward, hands reaching, eyes hollow. There were 13 of them, each labeled with Roman numerals. I was number 13. Suddenly the air shifted. Somewhere below, I heard a door open. Not slam, not creak. Open, as though someone had arrived. But I was alone. I clutched the book, the diaries, and fled the attic. Downstairs, the lights were on. I hadn't left them that way. The kitchen reeked of soil, wet, fresh. There were muddy footprints leading in from the back door, 13 of them. I counted. Then I followed them outside, flashlight trembling in my hand, to the edge of the garden. Something had been planted, a fresh mound of dirt, a wooden stake with a ribbon tied to it, and a name carved crudely into the wood. Mine. I left the Dunhill estate the next morning under a gray sky, the kind that felt too low, too heavy, like the clouds themselves were mourning. I drove back into the center of Black Hollow with a notebook filled with copied diary entries, photographs, and the first pages of the ritual manuscript hidden beneath a false panel in my duffel bag. I had no real plan, only a singular goal: uncover who else knew. Because someone had kept this secret alive for more than 1 century. My first stop was the Black Hollow General Store. one of the few places that still appeared operational. Inside, behind the counter, stood a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a posture too straight to be accidental. She wore an old iron key on a leather cord around her neck. "Morning," I said. "I'm staying up by the old Dunhill place." Her eyes narrowed. She didn't speak. "I inherited it," I added. "Didn't know about it until recently." Still silence. Then, "You're not supposed to stay there." I paused. "Why not?" She finally looked at me fully. "Because that house doesn't belong to anyone alive." I introduced myself and explained, carefully, that I was also a journalist, that I had documentation, and that I wasn't interested in folklore. I wanted facts. She stared at me for a long time before nodding toward the back room. "Speak with Harris," she said. "He used to run the archives before they disappeared." In the storage room, I found Harris Thorne, a man in his late 80s, hunched and nearly blind, seated among boxes of canned food and dusty tools. His hearing was intact, though, and when I repeated the name Dunhill, he flinched like I'd struck him. "I was 10 the first time the soil bloomed red," he said without prompting. 1937. My cousin Mary disappeared that spring. Folks said she ran off with a salesman, but I saw her dress in the roots, torn and bloody. She was number 11 that year. I asked him why no one ever spoke publicly about it, why no records remained, why no arrests were made. He shook his head. Because Black Hollow didn't want to die. According to Harris, the prosperity of the village, its once thriving orchards, its rare minerals, even the strange longevity of its residents, had always been quietly attributed to the Dunhill garden. Every 13 years it flourished with a force that defied nature. Those were the years of abundance. Water levels rose, livestock thrived, crops doubled in size. People made peace with the trade, Harris muttered. 13 disappear, 130 live better. And it's always people no one misses. Drifters, outcasts, foster children. The town learned how to look the other way. I asked about law enforcement. They get paid or they get silenced. We lost 3 sheriffs over 70 years. All ruled as accidents. None were. I pressed him for documents. Something concrete. Proof. He handed me a box wrapped in twine. "This belonged to my father. He was the last to try and stop them. He failed." Inside were brittle files, handwritten ledgers of missing persons reports, mostly from the years 1924, 1937, 1950, 1963, and onward in that exact 13-year rhythm. Every entry was marked with a red flower stamp in the margin, the same sigil I had seen in the attic. But the most damning piece was a map, dated Roman numeral 10, year 1956. It depicted the estate and surrounding area, overlaid with 13 marked positions. At the center, greenhouse main root chamber. Around it, numbers, initials, and in several places the phrase, "return to dust." I began contacting county offices in neighboring towns. Most denied having any Dunhill records, but in Essex County, I found a clerk willing to meet off the record. Her name was Tilda, and she had grown up near Dunhill Grove, the old plantation once linked to the family. "I've seen the files," she whispered as we met at a roadside diner, "but they're sealed under something called Environmental Containment Order 1952. It's just a cover. That land's poisoned, but not by chemicals." She handed me a photocopy of a single page, a coroner's report from that year. It listed 13 unidentified victims, found burned and buried in concentric circles. Cause of death, combustive exposure via non-natural accelerant. No further investigation. She leaned forward. "You don't understand. The roots don't just grow in Black Hollow. They're part of something older, bigger. You ever heard of the 13th harvest?" I hadn't. She explained. Every 13 cycles, every 169 years, a complete bloom was required. Not just 13 sacrifices. 169 bodies. A full reckoning. "The first bloom happened in 1783, she said. "The next would be now." My blood went cold. The family records I had found dated back exactly to that year. I returned to Black Hollow that night to find my car tires slashed. Inside the mansion, someone had rifled through my belongings. The diaries were gone. The manuscript was missing. Only the urns remained, still cold in the basement, still humming faintly if I pressed my ear close enough. On the front porch sat a note, handwritten in flowing script. "You're not the first to ask, but you'll be the last to leave. The gardener." The village was closing in. I noticed neighbors watching from windows. The store was shuttered the next day. The diner, out of business. The roads blocked by construction signs that hadn't been there before. I was being cordoned off, contained, not by force, by silence. It was Harris who came to me one final time. He brought with him an old box, wrapped in burlap and sealed with wax. Inside, a film reel, labeled Cycle 13, soil receives. I buried it in the 1970s, he said. It shows the ceremony, the real one. I found an old projector in the attic and played the reel in complete darkness. The footage was grainy, black and white, silent, but unmistakable. 13 figures in robes, a circle of ash, urns filled one by one, and at the center, a child, blindfolded, hands bound, standing in a pit surrounded by flowers. The final frame showed a face behind a bark mask. It turned toward the camera. It was me. The night before the new moon, I found the hidden door. It was behind the furnace in the basement, partially obscured by crates filled with cracked urns. The door itself was not wood or metal. It was stone, seamless at first glance, but the soot along the floor formed a faint outline. I only saw it because of the wind. Yes, wind, beneath the house, blowing outward. I pressed against the stone. It groaned. It moved. The wall opened with a low grind, revealing a staircase descending into utter blackness. I should have left. I should have sealed it, burned it, collapsed the entrance. But I didn't. I took a flashlight, a rope, and the blade I had found tucked into the attic floorboards, its handle engraved with a now familiar sigil, the flower spiraling around a skull. I descended slowly, counting each step aloud to remain sane. By step 13, I felt the temperature drop. By step 39, I lost the signal on my flashlight. By step 65, the walls began to pulse, not literally, but with a sound, a rhythm, like a heartbeat in the stone. At step 81, the staircase ended. I found myself in a subterranean chamber larger than the mansion above, the ceiling arched in cathedral-like curves, ribbed with root systems glowing faintly crimson. Along the walls were niches, 13 on each side, each containing an urn, a mask, and a small carved tablet. The central chamber held a circle of blackened soil, about 13 feet in diameter, encircled by bones arranged radially. In its center stood a stone altar, rough, veined with what looked like calcified blood, and inscribed with a single phrase repeated endlessly: 13 offered, 13 returned. Roman numeral 13, complete. Around the altar were seats, not chairs, but thrones grown from petrified vines. On each rested a cloak, a staff, and a mask. One was missing. The final throne was empty. I approached the altar and placed my hand upon it. It was warm. Beneath the stone, something shifted. The chamber began to hum. From the side wall, a tunnel extended, long, low, and ribbed with more roots. I followed it until it opened into what can only be described as a sanctuary of the grotesque. It was a vast archive, thousands of urns stacked from floor to ceiling in concentric shelves, each labeled with a name, a date, and a cycle. Cycle 1, Cycle 2, all the way to Cycle 13. In the center of this macabre library stood a living tree. Yes, living. Its bark was slick with sap that smelled of ash and iron. Its roots pierced the stone floor and pulsed with a rhythm identical to the sound I heard earlier. Hanging from its branches were masks, hundreds, and from those masks, fluids dripped into channels carved into the floor, leading back toward the altar. At the base of the tree, carved into a hollow, I found a book. This was no family record. This was doctrine. Its title, The Gardener's Testament, Roman numeral 1 to Roman numeral 13. Inside, I read the origin. Long before the Dunhills settled the land, a figure arrived, faceless, robed, bearing a seed said to be older than time. He was called the sower. He promised life everlasting to those who fed the soil not with water, but with the finality of death. He planted the first bloom during a moonless night in the year 1783. The root accepts no animal, no accident, no illness. It requires the willful release of life. 13 must offer. The bloom will feed, and in return, the bloodline shall never die. The original 13 formed a covenant. Every 13 years, their descendants would offer 13 lives, bound, marked, and burned. Their ashes would feed the garden, and in exchange, their family would thrive in secrecy, wealth, and unnatural longevity. The tree in the center of this sanctuary, it was the original bloom. It had outlived centuries, fed on over 1,690 souls, and it was not finished. Near the final pages of the book, a prophecy. When the 13th cycle completes, the roots will breach the surface. The gardener shall rise. The bloom will speak. And one final passage, written in blood. He who bears the bloodline and completes the offering shall become soil and seed, root and flower, guardian and gate. I was not just heir. I was chosen to become the next vessel. I dropped the book. Behind me, a sound, shuffling. From the tunnel emerged figures, cloaked, masked, silent. 13 of them. Each bore a staff, each carried an urn, each moved in absolute silence. At their head was a 14th figure, taller, mask made of living bark, pulsating with sap, the sour. He did not speak, he simply extended a hand, and I understood. I was to complete the cycle, or be consumed by it. The urns were placed in a circle, the altar lit from within. The roots began to bloom, flowers with petals of flesh and veins of gold, and from beneath the altar something began to emerge. A mass of roots, a form, a mouth without teeth, an eye without a face. It was not symbolic, it was alive. The garden had a body, and it wanted mine. I fled. I don't remember how. I scrambled back through the tunnels, the stairwell, the basement, out into the night. The mansion was burning, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe the light was from the soil itself, splitting open. Behind me I heard the roots rip through the greenhouse, vines climbing the walls, the land itself exhaling smoke. I turned once before reaching the forest line. The house collapsed inward, swallowed, and then silence. Not peace, just the absence of everything. I emerged from the forest at dawn, clothes torn, hands caked in ash, my mind unraveling thread by thread. I collapsed at the edge of Route 31, where a passing truck driver, an old man named Lionel, stopped and called emergency services. I was admitted to a hospital in Albany under suspicion of trauma-induced delusion. I stayed silent for the first 72 hours, refusing to speak, eat, or sleep. The images were still too fresh. The thrones of vine, the urns of bone, the altar pulsing like a second heart. But silence does not protect. It only delays the inevitable. When I finally spoke, it was to an FBI agent named Rebecca Lyon. She introduced herself calmly, showed me a photo of the Dunhill estate, and asked one question: why is there no house there anymore? Because there wasn't. According to satellite imagery taken only 48 hours after I escaped, the Dunhill mansion no longer existed, not even ruins. The land where it stood was now a shallow basin, overgrown, but curiously symmetrical. 13 concentric rings of foliage, unnaturally vibrant. I told them everything: the inheritance, the urns, the diaries, the stone chamber, the sour. They didn't laugh. That was the most terrifying part. Agent Lyon listened, took notes, and requested access to the contents of my duffel bag. I gave it willingly. The remaining artifacts, the mask, the photographs, the partial manuscript, were cataloged and transferred to Quantico. Within 2 weeks, a task force was dispatched to Black Hollow. They found nothing. The house was gone. The greenhouse erased. The stone altar chamber below the basement had collapsed, if it had ever existed. The town denied everything. No one had heard of the Dunhills. No one remembered the missing children. No one knew a man named Harris Thorne. The general store was shuttered, the diner torn down, the roads freshly paved. It was as if the village had been rewritten, but not entirely. One member of the task force, a geologist named Victor Hall, returned with a soil sample. He said it was unlike anything he had ever encountered, contained traces of carbonized human material, high concentrations of phosphorus, calcium, and residual cellular memory. His words, not mine. His lab caught fire 1 week later, officially ruled electrical. Unofficially, we never heard from Hall again. Agent Lyon remained in contact. Over the course of the next 3 months, she located 3 other individuals who had, at different points in their lives, been inheritors of forgotten estates with similar characteristics. Remote land, black soil, old stone greenhouses. All had suffered episodes of psychosis. All had experienced the same recurring dream: a tree with roots made of veins, 13 masks hanging from its branches, a voice whispering from the soil, Roman numeral 13 must bloom. One of them, a woman named Lee from rural Pennsylvania, disappeared shortly after agreeing to testify before a congressional subcommittee on environmental occultism. Her home was found empty. On the kitchen table, an urn, still warm. At my insistence, a formal petition was submitted to the Historical Preservation Office, requesting a federal excavation of the Dunhill grounds. The response was immediate and absolute. Site sealed under Executive Directive 7, Cultural Hazard Designation. No further action permitted. They buried it. Officially, but unofficially, the files moved deeper. I was later approached by a man calling himself Samuel Crane, claiming to be part of an internal intelligence unit tasked with containing ritual heritage threats. He told me in precise terms that I had triggered the final bloom cycle and that from this point forward, your silence is not requested. It is required. I asked him what that meant. He slid a document across the table. It was my birth certificate, the name Thomas Isaac Dunhill. I had never seen it before. It had been changed when I was adopted as a child. My real name, I was the 13th Thomas, Roman numeral 13, the final vessel. They didn't want to stop the ritual. They wanted to finish it. I fled that night, left the country. I changed my name, disappeared into corners of the world where the soil does not speak and the trees do not pulse. But the story did not die. 5 months after the event, a tremor was registered in northern New York. Not an earthquake. The geological record stated it was subsurface detonation without explosion. The center of the tremor, Black Hollow. Satellite images the next day showed the forest had grown rapidly, forming a perfect circle over 1 mile wide. At its center, nothing, just shadow. The town vanished. Every resident, every building, gone, as if it had never been there. But those of us who knew, we knew. A former archivist from Salem reached out to me anonymously. He said similar rituals had occurred in 1796, in 1869, in 1942, each one erased from public record, each one tied to a lineage that had tasted the garden. I contacted Agent Lyon one final time. Her number was disconnected, her file classified. I have reason to believe she was absorbed, not killed, but reclaimed, by the same network she once tried to expose. And as for me, I still dream of the chamber, of the thrones, of the tree that bleeds and breathes and remembers. But I'm no longer alone. Last week I received a letter, no return address. Inside, a photograph of my childhood home, and beneath it, in that same elegant script, soil recognizes its own. The story refused to stay buried. Despite the government's efforts to seal off the land, to redact the files, to erase the names, the ripples of what had happened at the Dunhill estate and what had been happening for centuries began to reach further. Like the roots of the garden itself, the truth threaded through cracks in silence and bloomed where least expected. It began in towns that had once been footnotes in the Dunhill migration: Providence, Salem, Lancaster, even remote regions of Quebec. Each place had its own version of a forgotten estate, a greenhouse now reduced to ruins, a lineage that quietly vanished. Journalists, archivists, and amateur historians started to cross-reference the details. The dates lined up, the disappearances matched, the symbols were identical. In Salem, a group of college students uncovered a locked cabinet in the basement of an abandoned botanical library. Inside, 13 pressed flowers, each labeled with a name and a Roman numeral. One of them, number 7, matched a girl who had gone missing in 1923, a case never solved. The cabinet had been untouched for nearly 1 century. In Lancaster, a farmer discovered a set of urns buried beneath his field after his tractor shattered a stone lid. The urns were arranged in a perfect circle. His crops had been growing in that spot for years. His family had never known hunger. In western Massachusetts, drone footage captured an inexplicable geometric pattern emerging in a patch of woods previously thought uninhabited. When examined on foot, investigators found a circle of 13 standing stones, newly surfaced from the earth, surrounding a central pit. Within the pit, ashes, human. As more reports emerged, pressure mounted. Independent researchers began calling it the cycle conspiracy, the idea that across North America, certain bloodlines had been cultivating soil through ritual sacrifice in exchange for power, longevity, and secrecy. The name Dunhill became shorthand in forums and leaked internal documents, but the public still dismissed it. The idea was too horrific, too coordinated, too ancient. Until the expose. A former archivist from the New York State Historical Bureau, using the pseudonym Harrow, leaked over 700 pages of internal memos, ritual transcriptions, and correspondence between private institutions and federal offices. The leak included satellite images showing patterns of overgrowth surrounding 13 known Dunhill-related sites, always in perfect symmetry, always appearing during new moon phases. The files contained evidence that dozens of missing persons cases over the last century had been sealed not due to lack of evidence, but under cultural containment orders, labeled as Directive Roman numeral 3. Public outrage followed, but it was the discovery in southern Ohio that tipped the scale. Construction workers unearthed an underground chamber during road development near the town of Fenlo. Inside, 13 stone chairs, a collapsed altar, and one massive root system, still alive, still bleeding sap. A federal team was dispatched, but before the site could be sealed, locals filmed the excavation. The footage went viral. Within 48 hours, the term 13th bloom trended globally. Suddenly, it wasn't folklore. It was history. Legislation began forming. the Cultural Ritual Protection Act, the Subterranean Anthropological Disclosure Amendment, and then, quietly, the Garden Control Initiative, buried deep in an appropriations bill, granting military funding to investigate and contain organic archaeological hazards. But some didn't want containment. Some wanted replication. Private cults began springing up, using fragments of the Dunhill texts to perform their own blooms. Bodies were found in imitation circles, gardens drenched in blood. Not all were fake, not all failed. Reports surfaced of miracle harvests, of people aging in reverse, of trees that spoke. The soil was listening again. Meanwhile, I remained in hiding. My identity had been scrubbed, my accounts frozen, but copies of the original manuscript I had saved in microfilm, hidden in plain sight, began surfacing. I sent them anonymously to universities, museums, indigenous research centers. Some were dismissed, others became obsessions. In a private symposium held in Denmark, botanists compared the Dunhill growth patterns to undocumented species found in Siberia, the Amazon, and beneath Icelandic lava beds. The root signature was the same. It was global, it was pre-human, and it had always been fed. Back in the United States, a commission was formed under the Department of Historical Integrity. They published a report, 300 pages long, admitting to a series of anomalous archaeological sites tied to ritualistic horticultural practices. But nowhere did they use the word sacrifice. Nowhere did they mention me, but I wasn't the only survivor anymore. A man named Elias, last name redacted, came forward claiming to have escaped a similar cycle in British Columbia. He described the same masked figures, the same underground chamber, the same moment of choice. He had refused to take the final throne. The garden punished him. Half his body was covered in lesions resembling bark. Doctors called it an autoimmune condition. He called it reclamation. He died 13 days after giving his interview. His blood sample was lost en route to the lab. Still, the symbols spread. Children in multiple cities were caught drawing the spiral root sigil in school notebooks. Street artists painted murals of masked figures with flowers for eyes. A church in Oregon burned itself to the ground after a mass sermon invoked the 13th harvest. No survivors, only a single phrase written in ash on the altar, "He returns by bloom." And in Washington, D.C., an anonymous package arrived at a senator's office. Inside, a single urn, still warm. I often ask myself if I could have stopped it. If, somewhere in that first moment, when I received the letter, when I opened the urns, when I descended into the soil, I had chosen differently, burned the documents, left the house, let the past remain buried. But the truth is, the garden would have found another, because it doesn't choose us, it grows us. I've moved 10 times in the past year, changed identities twice. I no longer use bank accounts. I don't stay near forests. I avoid the sound of wind through trees, and still I dream of roots beneath my bed, of ash rising from beneath my skin. Sometimes I wake with soil under my fingernails. Sometimes I don't remember falling asleep at all. The world is quieter now, not in the peaceful sense, but in the way a crowd goes silent before something happens, before the scream, before the bloom. The air feels heavier. People glance over their shoulders more. Whole towns have disappeared from digital maps. Archives go offline, one by one, and I know we are in the final cycle. Roman numeral 13 was not the end. It was the threshold. They said the tree would breach the surface when the last of the bloodline completed the offering, but I never completed it. I refused. I ran, and yet the garden still woke. So either the offering was never about me, or I was never meant to escape. Maybe I've been carrying it ever since. Maybe the garden only needed me to spread, to seed. Everywhere I've been since, things have withered, or bloomed too quickly. I saw a rose open in the snow. I saw a woman scream when her shadow detached from her feet. I saw 13 blackbirds die in formation above a chapel in Maine. I can't undo what's been rooted, but I can remember, and you can too. If this story has haunted you, if the soil beneath your home has felt colder, if the trees seem to lean closer, if your dreams echo with ash and thorns, don't look away. Don't let this history be buried again. Because the gardener isn't just a myth, he's ritual, and ritual always returns. So write the names down, speak of the vanished, burn the masks, if you find them, refuse the inheritance, bury no urn, plant nothing in cursed ground, and above all, never stand in a circle of 13. If this story has unsettled something in you, don't let it fade into silence. Like the families, like the towns, like the truth they tried to erase. Like, share, and subscribe. There are still names that need to be remembered, The next cycle is already growing, and it always begins with one seed.